You might think you know about the Roman Empire, the one with the togas and the gladiators, but there's a whole other chapter that lasted 1,000 years longer, a chapter full of strange twists and turns, where emperors were blinded instead of executed, where monks became political power players, and where a single city became the heart of a civilization that refused to die. It's a place where Roman law met Greek language, where Christian faith guided armies, and where an empire survived as a beacon of light, while the rest of Europe descended into what we now call the Dark Ages. It's a mystery why this empire, a successor to the mighty Rome, is so often overlooked, a vast and complex story largely confined to academic books. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you in the comments below. Let's dive in. Our story begins not with a dramatic collapse, but with a calculated move. The year is 324 AD, and the Roman Empire is, frankly, a mess. Internal strife, barbarian pressure, and a growing sense of spiritual emptiness plague a system that had once seemed invincible. But there is one man, Constantine the Great, who sees not just decay, but opportunity. He had just emerged victorious from a civil war, a brutal affair that left him as the sole ruler of the entire Roman world. Now, he needed a new start, a place to build a new Rome, one that was unburdened by the old gods and the senatorial squabbles of the Tiber. He found it on the shores of the Bosphorus, at the site of an old Greek town called Byzantium. The location was a geopolitical dream. It sat at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, controlling the sea lanes between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. It was a natural fortress, protected by water on 3 sides. It was also strategically placed to defend the eastern borders from the ever-present threat of the Sasanian Persian Empire. Constantine didn't just rebuild Byzantium, he transformed it into a new capital. He poured immense resources into the project, building magnificent forums, hippodromes, and palaces. He also filled the city with priceless art and monuments, often plundered from other parts of the empire, a bit like a Roman-era king who gets a new castle and decides to redecorate with all the best bits from the neighbors. On May 11th, 330 AD, he officially dedicated the city as Nova Roma, or New Rome, though history would forever remember it by his name, Constantinople. This act was more than just a change of address. It was a symbolic and practical shift of the empire's center of gravity from the Latin-speaking west to the Greek-speaking east. The city quickly grew into a vibrant metropolis, a bustling hub of commerce, culture, and power. It was a place where people of all walks of life, from merchants to scholars, would flock, creating a melting pot of ideas and influences that would come to define the empire's unique identity. It wasn't a seamless transition, of course. There were growing pains. The old Roman nobility in Rome grumbled about their loss of prestige and the logistical challenge of moving the entire imperial administration was a Herculean task. But Constantine was a man of immense will, and he pushed through, creating a city that would not only endure, but thrive for over a millennium. He also played a crucial role in the development of Christianity. Constantine himself converted to the faith, although historians still argue whether his conversion was a genuine spiritual awakening or a shrewd political calculation to unite his diverse empire under a single religion. Either way, he convened the First Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, a pivotal moment in Christian history where bishops gathered to establish a unified creed and condemn heretical beliefs, particularly Arianism. This move solidified Christianity's position within the empire and established a powerful precedent for imperial involvement in church affairs. It also helped to create a sense of shared identity among his subjects, which was crucial for a sprawling and multi-ethnic empire. The city itself became a bastion of Christian piety, with magnificent churches like the original Hagia Sophia being built and adorned. It was a city of saints and scholars, a place where theology was debated with as much passion as political policy. The seeds of the Byzantine Empire had been sown, and they were a fascinating mix of Roman tradition, Greek culture, and Christian faith, all housed in a sparkling new city on the Bosphorus. Constantine's vision had set the stage for a new kind of empire, one that would survive the fall of Rome and continue to tell its own epic story for centuries to come. Constantine's city, this new Rome, stood as a testament to his ambition, but his personal rule was just one chapter in a much larger story. After his death, the empire he had so painstakingly unified began to fray at the edges, a testament to the idea that empires, much like very old rugs, tend to fall apart right after you think you've got them laid out perfectly. For a time, his successors attempted to manage the vast Roman world from Constantinople, but the sheer scale of the empire, stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, was simply too much for one person to handle, especially with the increasingly hostile movements of various Germanic tribes. The pressure on the northern frontiers was immense, and the emperors found themselves constantly bouncing between crises in the east and the west. This constant back and forth was both exhausting and inefficient, leading to a de facto, if not official, split. This brings us to Theodosius IV, who was one of the last emperors to rule over a truly unified Roman Empire. He was a brilliant military man and a devout Christian, which made him an interesting and complicated figure. He's most famous for making Nicene Christianity the official state religion of the empire in 380 AD, an act that had monumental consequences for both the empire and the future of Europe. This wasn't just a simple decree. It was a powerful statement that effectively outlawed paganism and other Christian heresies, cementing the link between the emperor and the church. He even famously did penance in sackcloth and ashes for a massacre he ordered, a striking display of the growing moral authority of the church over the emperor. It's a moment that some historians still argue about. Was it a sign of genuine piety, or a shrewd political move to secure the support of the powerful Christian bishops? Either way, it showed that the rules of the game had changed. The emperor was no longer a god, but a mortal ruler who, at least in some matters, had to answer to a higher authority. But Theodosius's most lasting and arguably most fateful decision came on his deathbed in 395 AD. He had two sons, Arcadius and Honorius, and instead of leaving the empire to one successor, he officially divided the Roman world between them. Arcadius, the older but less capable brother, was given the Eastern Roman Empire, with Constantinople as his capital. Honorius, still a child, was given the Western Roman Empire, with its capital moving between Milan and Ravenna, far from Rome itself. This wasn't meant to be a permanent split. It was an administrative solution to a massive problem, but it proved to be the point of no return. The Western Empire, with its overstretched borders and a more fragile economy, would struggle for the next 80 years before its ultimate collapse. The Eastern Empire, however, with its wealthier provinces, more defensible borders, and a well-established capital in Constantinople, would not only survive, but thrive. While the Western Empire was being carved up by barbarian tribes like the Vandals, Goths, and Franks, the Eastern Empire was building its own unique identity. The political and cultural center of gravity shifted definitively. In the East, The Greek language, which had always been the tongue of commerce and high culture, began to replace Latin in official circles. The legal system, while still based on Roman law, started to evolve under new influences. The Christian Church, centered on the Patriarch of Constantinople, became a powerful institution, deeply intertwined with imperial politics and the daily lives of the citizens. The empire began to look less like ancient Rome and more like what we would now recognize as Byzantium. While the people of the East still saw themselves as Romans, their world was becoming a new synthesis of Roman administration, Greek culture, and Christian faith. The two halves of Theodosius's gift were not equal. The West would fall, leaving a legacy of fragmented kingdoms, while the East would become a beacon of learning, a fortress against invasion, and a living, breathing link to the classical past over another 1,000 years. Theodosius's final act, intended to secure the succession, instead created two separate destinies, and our story is focused squarely on the one that stood tall in the East. With the Western Roman Empire fading into a patchwork of unstable kingdoms, the eastern half, now firmly rooted in Constantinople, was ready to step out of its shadow and into its own spotlight. The city itself was a wonder, a bustling hub of over 500,000 people, and its emperors were no longer just Roman. They were something new, something we're beginning to call Byzantine. But this new identity didn't mean they forgot about their old one. In fact, they held on to the idea of a unified Roman Empire with an almost stubborn romanticism, a sentiment that would find its most powerful and ambitious expression in the reign of one of its most remarkable rulers, Justinian the Great. Justinian's reign, which began in 727 AD, was defined by a burning desire to restore the Roman Empire to its former glory. He was a man with a singular vision and a certain kind of intensity that you just don't see every day. He was a micromanager with a grand vision, a combination that made for a very interesting and sometimes very stressful time to be in his court. He had a few main goals: to reconquer the lost territories of the West, to reform the legal system, and to build a new Constantinople that would dazzle the world. And to his credit, he went after all three with a vigor that would make a modern CEO look lazy. His first major project was his military reconquest, which was led by his brilliant and often underrated general, Belisarius. Belisarius was the kind of general who won battles that seemed impossible, and his exploits read like something out of an adventure novel. First, he took on the Vandal kingdom in North Africa, a campaign that was shockingly quick and successful. With North Africa secured, Justinian turned his gaze to the ultimate prize. Italy. The Ostrogothic kingdom had taken over Italy, and Justinian saw it as a temporary occupation of sacred Roman soil. The Gothic War was a much longer and more brutal affair, lasting for nearly 2 decades and devastating the Italian peninsula. Belisarius and his successor, Narses, fought a seemingly endless series of battles and sieges. The city of Rome itself changed hands multiple times, a symbol of the back-and-forth nature of the conflict. While Justinian's forces were ultimately victorious, the cost was immense, both in terms of lives and treasure. The Byzantine Empire was stretched to its absolute limits, and the reconquered territories were often difficult and expensive to hold. But Justinian's legacy wasn't just written in blood. He was also a profound legal reformer. The Roman legal system, which had evolved over 1,000 years, was a chaotic mess of overlapping laws, decrees, and interpretations. It was, to put it mildly, a legal labyrinth that only a handful of scholars could navigate. Justinian saw this chaos and decided to bring order to it. He commissioned a team of jurists to compile and codify all existing Roman law, a monumental undertaking that resulted in the Corpus Juris Civilis, or the body of civil law. This massive work was divided into three main parts: the Code, which collected all imperial laws; the Digest, which summarized the opinions of great Roman jurists; and the Institutes, a textbook for law students. This wasn't just a simple reorganization, it was a distillation of centuries of legal thought into a coherent, usable form. It became the foundation of Byzantine law for centuries, and would later be rediscovered and become the basis for civil law systems across most of Western Europe. It's hard to overstate its importance. It's a mainstream historical fact that modern legal systems around the world owe a great debt to Justinian's ambitious legal project. And finally, there was his building program. The city of Constantinople was Justinian's canvas. He repaired aqueducts, built new fortifications, and most famously, rebuilt the Hagia Sophia. The original church had been destroyed during the Nika riots in 532 AD, a massive urban uprising that nearly toppled his rule. Justinian responded to the chaos not just with brutal force, but with an act of architectural genius. He commissioned two brilliant geometers, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, to design a church that would be unlike anything the world had ever seen. The result was the Hagia Sophia, a masterpiece of engineering with a massive, seemingly floating dome that still inspires awe today. It was a physical manifestation of Justinian's vision for the empire, grand, powerful, and deeply Christian. He had, in his mind, not just restored the empire, but elevated it. Justinian's reign, for all its ambition and glory, was not a story of unmitigated triumph. Like a perfectly baked souffle, the empire was about to face a sudden and dramatic collapse. The military campaigns to reconquer the West were incredibly expensive, and the newly won territories were a logistical and financial burden. The Byzantine treasury was stretched thin, and the empire's resources were at their absolute limit. But the most devastating blow would not come from a rival army or a political rebellion. It would come from a microscopic, unseen enemy that would change the course of history forever. In the year 541 AD, a mysterious and terrifying plague swept through the Eastern Roman Empire, originating in Egypt and rapidly spreading along the bustling trade routes of the Mediterranean. This was the first major pandemic in centuries, and it was absolutely relentless. The disease, later identified as Yersinia pestis, the same bacteria responsible for the Black Death nearly 800 years later, arrived in Constantinople in 542 AD. The city, with its densely packed population and vibrant port, was the perfect breeding ground for disaster. The accounts from the historian Procopius are chilling, describing a city where the streets were filled with the dead and dying. At the peak of the outbreak, as many as 5,000 people were dying each day in Constantinople alone, a number that seems almost incomprehensible. The plague didn't discriminate. It took the rich and the poor, the young and the old. The emperor himself, Justinian, fell ill but miraculously recovered, though some say he was never quite the same after that. The impact of the plague of Justinian was nothing short of catastrophic. The pandemic ravaged the entire empire, from the bustling cities to the remote countryside. The demographic toll was staggering, with some estimates suggesting that the empire's population was reduced by a quarter to a third. The economic consequences were equally severe. With so many people dead, there was a chronic labor shortage. Fields lay fallow, workshops were silent, and tax revenues plummeted. This was a brutal 1-2 punch for an empire already financially exhausted by war. The ambitious military campaigns that had just brought Italy and North Africa back into the fold now seemed unsustainable. The manpower needed to garrison these far-flung provinces simply wasn't there anymore. The dream of a fully restored Roman Empire, which had seemed so close under Justinian, now began to feel like a distant, fading memory. Historians still debate the full long-term impact of the plague, but it's a mainstream historical fact that it was a major contributing factor to the empire's subsequent decline. The plague wasn't a one-time event. It returned in waves over the next 2 centuries, preventing the population from fully recovering and keeping the empire in a state of perpetual weakness. It also fundamentally changed the social and political landscape. The power of the emperor was shaken. How could a ruler protect his people from such an invisible, inescapable foe? The church, on the other hand, saw its influence grow as people sought spiritual comfort and an explanation for the unfolding disaster. It was a time of immense fear and uncertainty, a grim and shadowy counterpoint to the architectural and legal brilliance that had defined the first half of Justinian's reign. So, while Justinian the Great is remembered for his reconquests and his codification of Roman law, his legacy is also indelibly linked to this terrible pandemic. He built the Hagia Sophia and dreamed of uniting the Roman world, but a tiny bacterium would prove to be a more formidable foe than any Gothic king or Persian army. The plague acted as a brutal punctuation mark at the end of a golden age, forcing the empire to retreat from its grandiose ambitions and focus on mere survival. The vast, sprawling empire of Justinian began to shrink, to hunker down, and to prepare for the long, hard century that lay ahead. The grand dream of Roman restoration was over, and the Byzantine Empire would now have to forge a new identity, one born not of conquest, but of resilience in the face of unimaginable tragedy. The Byzantine Empire, battered and bruised by the plague, was now a wounded giant, a fact that its old rival, the Sasanian Persian Empire, was quick to notice. For centuries, these two colossal empires had been locked in a cold war, occasionally punctuated by brutal, bloody conflicts. Now, with Byzantium weakened and a new, ambitious Sasanian king on the throne, Khusrau II, the stage was set for the last and most dramatic of their great wars. This brings us to the reign of Emperor Heraclius, a man whose story is so full of twists and turns that it feels more like a cinematic epic than a historical period. He's a fascinating figure, and the tale of his reign is one of a man who took an empire on the brink of total collapse and, through sheer force of will, pulled it back from the abyss, only to see a new, even more powerful threat emerge on the horizon. Heraclius came to power in 610 AD after sailing from Carthage to Constantinople to depose the tyrannical Emperor Phocas. He arrived to find the empire in a state of utter disarray. The treasury was empty, the army was demoralized, and the Persians were on the warpath. Khusrau II, using the pretext of avenging his friend and ally, the deposed Emperor Maurice, had launched a massive invasion. The Persian armies were incredibly successful, carving a swathe through the Byzantine East. They conquered Syria, Palestine, and even captured Jerusalem in 614 AD, taking the most sacred Christian relic, the true cross, back to their capital. The sight of Persian troops in Jerusalem was a profound shock to the Christian world, and it was a symbol of just how dire the situation had become. At the same time, Avar and Slavic tribes were attacking from the north, besieging Constantinople itself. It felt like the end of the world was at hand. Heraclius, however, was not a man to give up easily. For the first few years of his reign, he focused on consolidation and reform. He revamped the army, reorganized the provinces into military districts called themes, and, in a desperate but necessary move, appealed to the church to help fund his campaigns, framing the conflict as a holy war to reclaim the true cross. He even considered abandoning Constantinople for Carthage at one point, but he was ultimately persuaded to stay and fight he did. In 622 AD, Heraclius took a huge gamble, leaving the defense of Constantinople to others and leading his army in a bold counteroffensive deep into Persian territory. He was no longer just a figurehead, he was a general, leading his men from the front. Over the next 6 years, he waged a brilliant and relentless campaign, fighting battle after battle in what is now modern-day Turkey, Armenia, and Mesopotamia. He used clever tactics, outmaneuvering the larger Persian armies, and his campaign was a masterclass in military strategy. The climax of this epic struggle came in 627 AD at the Battle of Nineveh, where Heraclius's army decisively defeated the main Persian force. This victory, combined with the successful defense of Constantinople against a combined Avar-Persian siege, broke the back of the Sasanian Empire. Khusrau II was overthrown and executed by his own son, and a peace treaty was signed. The Byzantines had not only survived, but had won a total victory. The empire was restored, the true cross was returned to Jerusalem in a magnificent ceremony, and Heraclius was hailed as a new Roman hero. It was an astonishing comeback, a testament to the resilience of the Byzantine state. However, historians still argue whether this victory was a Pyrrhic one. Both the Byzantine and Sasanian empires were left completely exhausted by the conflict. Their treasuries were empty, their armies were decimated, and their border provinces were ravaged. It was a classic case of two giants fighting to a standstill, and in doing so, creating a power vacuum that a new, dynamic force would soon fill. Heraclius had saved the empire from one threat, but in the process, he had inadvertently set the stage for the rise of another. The ink on the peace treaty with Persia was barely dry before news of a new power emerging from the Arabian Peninsula began to filter north. The era of the great Roman-Persian wars was over, and a new age of struggle was about to begin. Heraclius, our worn-out hero, had just secured a hard-won victory against the Persians. The true cross was safely back in Jerusalem. The empire had a new lease on life, and it seemed as though the Byzantines could finally breathe a collective sigh of relief. If this were a movie, this is where the credits would roll. But history, as you know, is a bit more complicated and a lot less merciful. For Heraclius, the ink on the peace treaty with Persia was barely dry before a new storm, one that would make the Sasanian conflict look like a minor squabble, was gathering on the horizon. This new force was the Islamic caliphate, a power that would emerge from the deserts of Arabia with a speed and ferocity that no one, not even the battle-hardened Byzantines, could have predicted. The emergence of Islam under the Prophet Muhammad in the Arabian Peninsula was a seismic event that would reshape the entire Mediterranean world. It created a powerful, unified, and expansionist state with a religious fervor that was both a military and ideological force multiplier. The Byzantines, who were used to dealing with the organized armies of the Persians or the shifting tribes of the Goths, were now facing something entirely different. They were encountering a highly motivated, mobile, and unified army that was driven by a new faith. The speed of the conquests was truly astonishing. The Byzantine armies, still exhausted from their long war with Persia, were simply not prepared for this new threat. They had spent the last several decades fighting an old enemy, and now a new one that had been building its strength in the background, was at their gates. The first major confrontation came in Syria. Heraclius's forces, led by his brother Theodore, were soundly defeated by the Muslim armies in a series of battles. The city of Damascus fell in 635 AD, and by 636 AD, the two forces met at the fateful Battle of Yarmouk. This was one of the most decisive battles in history. The Byzantine army was large, but it was a coalition of different forces and lacked the unity and single-minded purpose of the Muslim armies. The battle was a disaster for the Byzantines. They suffered a crushing defeat that effectively ended their control over Syria. Heraclius, watching the news arrive in Constantinople, is said to have retreated to his palace, a broken man, muttering, "Farewell, Syria, and what a splendid country this is for the enemy." It was a profoundly emotional moment for a man who had just saved the empire from a seemingly impossible situation. The province, a source of immense wealth and manpower for centuries, was now lost forever. The loss of Syria was just the beginning. The Islamic Caliphate continued its relentless advance, fueled by its military successes and the promise of new lands. Egypt, the breadbasket of the Byzantine Empire, fell next. The province was rich and strategically vital, but its population, who were often alienated from the central government in Constantinople due to religious differences, did not resist the new invaders with the same ferocity as they might have otherwise. Alexandria, one of the greatest cities in the ancient world, surrendered in 642 AD. With Egypt gone, the Byzantines lost their primary source of grain and a huge portion of their tax revenue. The empire was now financially crippled. The loss of these core provinces, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, was a blow from which the Byzantine Empire would never fully recover. The empire was now geographically and culturally smaller, its center of gravity shifting firmly to Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. This new reality forced the empire to fundamentally reorganize itself. It was no longer a vast, sprawling state. It was a smaller, more centralized, and more militarized state. The system of themes that Heraclius had begun to implement, military districts where soldiers were granted land in exchange for service, became the new bedrock of the empire's defense. The people of the empire now spoke Greek, not Latin, and their identity was increasingly defined by their Orthodox Christian faith and their struggle against their new Islamic neighbors. The old Roman dream of a Mediterranean-spanning empire was now well and truly dead, replaced by the grim reality of a struggle for survival on a much smaller scale. With the empire's vast eastern provinces lost to the Islamic Caliphate, the Byzantines found themselves in a new defensive posture. This was a smaller, tougher empire, and it was under this immense pressure that a profound and often bewildering religious and political struggle began to unfold. The iconoclast controversy. This wasn't just a simple theological debate. It was a century-long civil war over the nature of religious art that would divide the empire and fundamentally redefine its relationship with the Church and the West. It all started with an emperor who had a very strong opinion about what should and should not be in a church. The controversy began in earnest with Emperor Leo III, who came to the throne in 717 AD, right as the empire was facing one of its most perilous moments. The Islamic armies had laid a massive siege to Constantinople itself, a siege that lasted for nearly 2 years. Leo III, a brilliant military leader, successfully repelled the invaders, earning him immense prestige and giving him the political capital to push through a radical reform. He believed that the empire's recent misfortunes were a sign of God's displeasure, and that this displeasure was caused by the veneration of religious images, or icons. In his eyes and in the eyes of many who agreed with him, the veneration of icons was a form of idolatry, a violation of the second commandment. In 726 AD, he issued a decree forbidding the veneration of icons, and a few years later, he ordered the destruction of religious images throughout the empire. This act, known as iconoclasm, was a shocking and deeply unpopular move. The empire was immediately split into two warring factions: the iconoclasts, image breakers, and the iconodules, image venerators. The iconoclasts were generally supported by the military and the emperor, particularly in the eastern provinces of Asia Minor, where the influence of Islam's aniconic traditions might have played a role. They argued that icons were little more than idols, and that the only true objects of veneration were the cross and the Eucharist. They saw the reverence shown to icons as a primitive, superstitious practice that was beneath the sophisticated Christian faith of the empire. On the other side were the iconodules, who were a diverse group that included monks, theologians, and a large portion of the general populace, especially in the western parts of the empire and in Constantinople. They argued that icons were not worshipped, but rather venerated as a way of honoring the holy figures they represented. They saw them as a powerful tool for teaching the illiterate about the faith and for fostering a deeper spiritual connection. The monks, in particular, were powerful defenders of icons, and their monasteries became centers of resistance to imperial policy. The conflict wasn't just confined to theological debates. It was a messy, violent affair. Emperors would rise and fall based on their stance on icons. Monks were persecuted, their monasteries were seized, and icons were systematically destroyed. The most notorious of these emperors was Leo's son, Constantine V, a brutal and effective military leader who was a fanatical iconoclast. His persecution of the iconodules was particularly harsh, and he earned the posthumous nickname, the Dung-Named, from his opponents for his ruthlessness. He called a council in 754 AD that formally condemned icon veneration, but its legitimacy was never accepted by the rest of the Christian world. It's a fascinating look into a time when theological differences could lead to real-world bloodshed, and it's a mainstream historical fact that this schism had a profound impact on the empire's internal stability for over a century. The iconoclast controversy also had significant geopolitical consequences. The popes in Rome, who were staunchly iconodule, saw the Byzantine emperor's iconoclasm as a heretical abuse of power. This deep division contributed to the growing rift between the Eastern and Western churches, a rift that would eventually lead to the Great Schism of 1054. It also gave the popes a powerful pretext to seek a new protector, and they found one in the Frankish kings, particularly Charlemagne. The pope's decision to crown Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans in 800 AD was a direct challenge to the authority of the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople, and marked a definitive break between the two halves of the old Roman world. The controversy would continue to ebb and flow, but it had irrevocably changed the landscape of the empire, leaving it more isolated from the West and more internally fractured than ever before. The iconoclast controversy, this great messy debate over religious imagery, was a bit like a fire that would smolder and then flare up again for generations. Emperors, theologians, and peasants all had a stake in it, and the back and forth was constant. But like all things, it couldn't last forever. The tide began to turn, and a major player in this shift was a woman of immense ambition and ruthlessness, the Empress Irene. Her story is a fascinating, if sometimes terrifying, example of how a woman could seize and wield power in a male-dominated world, and her reign would be a turning point for both the empire and the fate of icons. Irene was the wife of Emperor Leo IV, the son of the fanatical iconoclast Constantine V. When Leo IV died in 780 AD, their son Constantine VI was only 10 years old, and Irene became his regent. As a secret iconodule, Irene had to be incredibly cautious. She couldn't just reverse her father-in-law's policies overnight. She had to move with political cunning and a good deal of patience. Her first move was to install an iconodule patriarch in Constantinople, a man named Tarasios, who was willing to work with her to restore the veneration of icons. The stage was set for a major showdown. Irene and Tarasios called an ecumenical council to settle the matter once and for all. This was a bold move, as they knew they would face a lot of opposition from the iconoclast military and nobility. The first attempt to hold the council in 786 AD was a spectacular failure. Iconoclast soldiers, still loyal to the legacy of Constantine V, burst into the church and broke up the proceedings, threatening the bishops and forcing them to disperse. It was an embarrassing public display of the deep divisions within the empire. But Irene wasn't one to give up. She was a master of political maneuvering. She bided her time, and a couple of years later, she quietly removed the most dangerous iconoclast regiments from Constantinople and sent them on a bogus military expedition. With her opposition out of the way, she reconvened the council in Nicaea, the very same city where Constantine the Great had held his famous council centuries earlier. This time, the council was a success. In 787 AD, the Second Council of Nicaea officially condemned iconoclasm and restored the veneration of icons. It was a huge victory for Irene and the iconodual cause, and it's a mainstream historical fact that this council is considered the last of the 7 great ecumenical councils of the Christian Church. With her goal accomplished, Irene had a new problem. Her son, Constantine VI, was now a grown man. He was the legitimate emperor, and he was tired of being in his mother's shadow. He tried to assert his independence, but Irene, who had tasted power, wasn't about to give it up. A bitter struggle for control of the empire ensued, a tragic family drama that ended in a truly shocking and brutal fashion. In 797 AD, Irene had her own son captured, and in a truly horrifying act, ordered his eyes to be gouged out. It was a common Byzantine punishment for deposed rivals, but to do it to your own son was a new level of ruthlessness. Constantine VI died shortly after, and Irene ruled the empire alone as the first empress in her own right. She even styled herself as Basileus, the male title for emperor, a striking detail that shows just how she saw herself. Her reign, however, was not long. While she had restored the icons, she was not a particularly effective ruler otherwise. Her actions had alienated many, and her gender was a major problem for a lot of people, especially in the West. It was during her reign, in 800 AD, that Pope Leo III, arguing that the Byzantine throne was vacant because a woman could not rule, crowned Charlemagne as the new Emperor of the Romans. This was a bold and audacious move that challenged Irene's legitimacy and further cemented the split between East and West. Irene was eventually overthrown in 802 AD in a bloodless coup and exiled to the island of Lesbos, where she died a year later. The controversy over icons would continue to simmer for a little while longer, but Irene had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to its final resolution. Her story, a complex mix of religious piety, political savvy, and cold-blooded ambition, is a perfect example of the high stakes and brutal politics of the Byzantine court. With Empress Irene's brutal reign over and the iconoclast controversy dying down, the Byzantine Empire entered a new phase, a period of remarkable resurgence and stability that is often called the Macedonian Renaissance. This golden age was ushered in not by a brilliant general or a learned scholar, but by a man who started his life as a peasant and a stable boy from a humble family in Macedonia. His name was Basil Warner, and his rise to power is a tale of ambition, assassination, and an unshakable belief in his own destiny. It's a story that proves you don't need a fancy pedigree to be a great emperor. You just need a lot of nerve and a little luck. Basil the Warner's story is a classic rags-to-riches tale with a very dark twist. He came to Constantinople seeking his fortune and, through a series of fortunate connections, caught the eye of the reigning emperor, Michael III, a rather dissolute and ineffective ruler who was more interested in horse racing and carousing than in the affairs of state. Basil became Michael's chamberlain, a trusted position that put him in the inner circle of power. However, Michael's favoritism eventually soured. In 867 AD, Basil, sensing his own position was in danger, made a bold move. He orchestrated the assassination of Michael III, his own patron, and seized the throne for himself. It was a violent and illegitimate takeover, but Basil proved to be a far more capable ruler than his predecessor. He founded the Macedonian dynasty, a line of emperors who would rule the Byzantine Empire for nearly 2 centuries, a period of unparalleled success. Basil's reign marked a definitive turning point for the empire. He was a natural administrator and a shrewd military leader. He consolidated the empire's borders, pushing back against both the Arabs in the east and the troublesome Bulgarians in the north. His military campaigns were incredibly successful, but he also understood the importance of diplomacy and building a strong, professional army. He reorganized the Byzantine military, making it one of the most effective fighting forces in the world. He was a restorer of order in every sense. He also initiated a major legal reform, commissioning a new law code, the Basilica, which revised and updated Justinian's old legal texts. This legal work was a continuation of the tradition of Roman law and solidified the empire's legal foundation for centuries to come. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Basilica was a key legal text used in Byzantium until its final collapse. The Macedonian era wasn't just about military and legal reforms. It was also a time of stunning cultural and artistic revival. The iconoclast controversy was finally and definitively put to rest in 843 AD, a few decades before Basil's reign began, allowing for a glorious rebirth of religious art. Artists once again began to create beautiful mosaics and icons, adorning churches with vibrant images of saints and biblical scenes. Constantinople itself was beautified, with new churches, palaces, and public works being built. It was a time of great intellectual curiosity, with scholars delving into classical Greek texts, preserving and copying them for future generations. This period of artistic and intellectual flourishing is what historians refer to as the Macedonian Renaissance, a term that really highlights the era's similarity to the later Renaissance in Italy, where there was also a rediscovery of classical knowledge. The empire was not just surviving, it was thriving, a beacon of civilization in a world that was still largely in the dark. The reign of the Macedonian dynasty would continue this trend of success. Emperors like Nikephoros Phocas and John the Tsimiskes would lead brilliant campaigns against the Arabs, pushing the empire's borders further east and even recapturing some lost territories in Syria. The empire's wealth and prestige grew, and Constantinople once again became a dominant force in the Mediterranean world. It was a period where the Byzantine Empire could finally flex its muscles, demonstrating that it was far from a dying relic of the past. It was a vibrant, powerful, and culturally rich state, with a lot of life left in it. Basil the Faun, the peasant who became an emperor and a dynastic founder, had set the stage for one of the most glorious chapters in Byzantine history, and his legacy would be carried on by his incredibly capable successors. The Macedonian Renaissance continued its upward trajectory, but every golden age needs a hero, or perhaps a terrifying anti-hero, to truly define it. For the Byzantine Empire, that figure was Basil II, a man so determined and so singularly focused on his goals that he earned a nickname that sends a shiver down your spine: the Bulgar Slayer. He was the great-great-grandson of Basil I, and he would take the family business of imperial success to a whole new and often brutal level. His long reign from 976 to 1025 represents the absolute zenith of Byzantine military power and territorial expansion. Basil II came to the throne as a young man, but his path to absolute power was not an easy one. For the first 2 decades of his reign, He had to contend with powerful internal threats, namely, two massive rebellions led by formidable Byzantine generals who felt they had a better claim to the throne. These rebellions were a serious challenge to imperial authority, and Basil had to fight for his life to secure his rule. He eventually put them down with a ruthless efficiency, showing a side of his personality that would become all too familiar to his enemies. After consolidating his power, he turned his attention to the empire's borders, and there was one enemy in particular that had been a thorn in the side of Byzantium for centuries: the Bulgarian Empire. The First Bulgarian Empire, under its formidable Tsar Samuel, had become a powerful and dangerous rival to the north. For decades, they had raided Byzantine territory, and Samuel had even crowned himself Emperor of the Bulgarians, a direct challenge to the Byzantine emperor's claim to universal authority. Basil II took this challenge personally. He was no longer just an emperor, he was a man on a mission. The war he waged against the Bulgarians was relentless and total. He campaigned almost every year, leading his army in person, a stark contrast to some of his more sedentary predecessors. He was a master of logistics and siege warfare, and he systematically wore down the Bulgarian defenses. This wasn't a quick war, it was a grueling, decades-long slog, a testament to both Basil's unwavering resolve and the stubborn resistance of the Bulgarians. The climax of this long conflict came in 1014 at the Battle of Clydion. Basil II's forces ambushed a Bulgarian army in a narrow mountain pass, inflicting a devastating defeat. The battle itself was a major victory, but what happened next is what earned Basil his grim nickname and cemented his place in history. He reportedly captured 15,000 Bulgarian soldiers. Instead of executing them all, which was a common practice, he took a more creative approach. He blinded all but one in every 100 men, leaving that one-eyed soldier to lead his blinded comrades back to Tsar Samuel. When Samuel saw the horrific sight of his army returning, a mass of blinded men, the shock was so great that he reportedly suffered a heart attack and died a few days later. It was a cold, calculated act of psychological warfare that was brutally effective. Historians still argue about the exact number of men blinded and whether the story is entirely true, but it's a mainstream historical fact that this event cemented Basil's reputation as the Bulgar Slayer and broke the back of Bulgarian resistance. With the Bulgarian Empire destroyed and incorporated into the Byzantine Empire, Basil II turned his attention to other threats. He campaigned in the east against the Arabs, securing a new Armenian frontier, and even made a show of force in Italy. He was a true warrior emperor, and his reign left the Byzantine Empire at its largest territorial extent since the time of Justinian, and its most financially secure. He also fostered the arts and learning, but his main legacy was a military one. He created an empire that was secure, powerful, and respected across the known world. However, he also left a problem for his successors. He had focused so much on the military that he hadn't prepared a clear line of succession, a common problem for emperors who spend their whole lives on the battlefield and not enough time in the palace. After his death, the Macedonian dynasty would begin a slow but steady decline, setting the stage for the next great challenge the empire would face. The death of Basil II, the great Bulgar slayer, left a massive void in the Byzantine Empire. He had provided an incredible period of stability and military success, but he hadn't produced an heir, and his successors lacked his iron will and military genius. The Macedonian dynasty began to wobble, a classic case of what happens when a strong man leaves no strong man to follow him. The empire, with its vast wealth and powerful military, began to be plagued by internal political strife, with a series of weak emperors and powerful aristocratic families vying for control. This political instability, coupled with economic problems and a new wave of invasions from the Seljuk Turks in the east and the Normans in the west, plunged the empire into a new crisis. It was a chaotic, confusing time, and it was out of this chaos that the Komnenian dynasty would emerge, a family that would once again pull the empire back from the brink of collapse, only to find themselves facing a new and completely unexpected kind of visitor from the west. The Komnenian dynasty's rise to power began in 1081 with Alexios IV Komnenos, a shrewd and capable general who seized the throne in a coup. He inherited an empire that was in shambles. The Seljuk Turks had just won a devastating victory against the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, a battle that led to the loss of most of Asia Minor, the empire's traditional heartland and source of its soldiers and food. The Normans, under the ambitious Robert Guiscard, were raiding the empire's western territories, and the treasury was once again empty. Alexios was a master of diplomacy and military pragmatism. He couldn't fight all his enemies at once, so he used a combination of clever alliances, bribery, and military action to slowly stabilize the empire. He managed to push back the Normans and began a slow and painful reconquest of Asia Minor from the Turks. But the threat was still immense, and he needed help. In 1095, Alexios made a fateful decision that would alter the course of both Byzantine and European history forever. He sent an appeal to Pope Urban II in Rome, asking for military assistance to help him fight the Turks and reclaim the holy sites of Jerusalem. He was looking for a few thousand professional soldiers, some mercenaries, to augment his own forces. What he got, however, was something far grander and far more chaotic. Urban II took Alexios's plea and, at the Council of Clermont, transformed it into a call for a holy war to liberate Jerusalem from the Muslims. The response was overwhelming. Across Europe, thousands upon thousands of men, from powerful nobles to landless peasants, took up the cross and began to march east. This was the First Crusade, and Alexios, who had asked for a few trained soldiers, was now dealing with a human tsunami of angry, armed pilgrims with their own ideas about how to run a war. The arrival of the Crusaders in Constantinople was a diplomatic nightmare for Alexios. They were a mixed bag, to say the least. There were hardened professional warriors, but there were also undisciplined mobs who looted the countryside and caused all sorts of trouble. The Byzantine court was horrified by their manners, their hygiene, and their general disregard for imperial authority. Alexios handled the situation with an incredible amount of political finesse, using a combination of flattery, threats, and a healthy dose of bribery to manage the Crusader leaders. He insisted that the leaders swear an oath of fealty to him and promise to return any Byzantine cities they recaptured. Most of the Crusader leaders agreed, though they did so with a certain amount of reluctance. Despite the difficulties, the First Crusade was a stunning military success. The Crusaders and the Byzantine forces worked together, and they were able to recapture a large swath of Asia Minor for the Byzantine Empire and ultimately take Jerusalem itself. For a time, it seemed as though Alexios's gambit had paid off perfectly. He had used the Crusaders to secure his borders and had re-established Byzantine power in the region. However, this success came at a cost. The Crusaders established their own independent states in the Levant, and their relationship with the Byzantines was always strained, often devolving into open conflict. The arrival of the Crusaders had opened a Pandora's box of new political and military complexities, and the Komnenian emperors, particularly Alexios's successors, would have to navigate this new world, where the West was no longer a distant memory, but a constant and often aggressive presence on their borders. Alexios the Orator had successfully navigated the diplomatic minefield of the First Crusade, but the seeds he had sown would sprout into a much more complicated and dangerous political landscape for his successors. The Comnenian dynasty, now firmly in power, had to deal with the constant presence of Westerners. The Crusader states in the Levant, the powerful Italian maritime republics like Venice and Genoa, and the Norman kingdoms in the west. This brings us to Alexios' grandson, Manuel the Comnenos, an emperor who would embrace this new reality with a gusto that was both impressive and, ultimately, disastrous. Manuel was a fascinating character, a true paradox, a brilliant military commander and diplomat who was also a romantic, almost quixotic figure with a deep admiration for the West. He was, in a sense, a man caught between two worlds, and his reign would see a Byzantine Empire that looked westward with a renewed and often misguided ambition. Manuel came to the throne in 1143, and from the start he was a very different kind of emperor. He was a great lover of Western culture, fluent in Latin, and a keen participant in jousting tournaments, a practice that was absolutely unheard of for a Byzantine emperor. He married two Western princesses, a German and a French one, and he filled his court with Westerners, much to the chagrin of the traditional Byzantine nobility. He saw himself not just as the emperor of the Byzantines, but as a major player in the grand game of European politics. His foreign policy was a complex web of alliances, rivalries, and military campaigns that stretched from the Balkans to the Crusader states and to Italy itself. His primary goal was to restore Byzantine influence in the Italian peninsula, a dream that hadn't been seriously pursued since the time of Justinian. He saw the Normans of southern Italy as a constant threat, and he wanted to re-establish a foothold on the Italian mainland. He formed an alliance with the Pope, and, in 1155, he sent an army to invade southern Italy, taking several cities and provinces. For a brief moment, it seemed as though he might actually succeed in his grand project. However, the campaign was ultimately a failure. His allies betrayed him, the Normans proved to be a more formidable foe than he had anticipated, and he was forced to withdraw. His ambitious plan to restore a Byzantine presence in Italy had failed, and it had drained the empire's resources in the process. Manuel's pro-Western policies also had significant economic and political consequences. He granted extensive trading privileges to the Italian city-states of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa. At first, this was a smart move, as it secured powerful naval allies and boosted the empire's economy. But over time, the Italian merchants became incredibly wealthy and powerful, and they began to dominate the Byzantine economy, pushing native Byzantine merchants out of the market. The Venetians, in particular, became a state within a state, and their arrogance and economic power led to a great deal of resentment among the population of Constantinople. This simmering resentment would later boil over with tragic consequences. Manuel's reign was a time of immense cultural flourishing and military campaigns, but it also saw the rise of internal problems that would plague his successors. His focus on the West meant he was often distracted from the growing threat in the East, the Seljuk Turks. His one major military defeat, the Battle of Myriokephalon in 1176, was a crushing loss to the Turks that showed the limits of Byzantine power and allowed the Seljuks to solidify their control over Central Asia Minor. It was a grim reminder that no amount of Western flair could solve the empire's fundamental problems. Historians still argue whether Manuel's pro-Western policy was a brilliant but ultimately unlucky strategy, or a fatal miscalculation that alienated his own people and led to the empire's eventual decline. What is a mainstream historical fact, however, is that his reign was a period of intense engagement with the West, a relationship that was both a source of strength and ultimately a source of profound weakness for the Byzantine Empire. Manuel III's Western ambitions had left the empire a bit wobbly, both politically and economically, and his death in 1180 marked the end of the Comnenian Golden Age. What followed was a period of intense internal strife, a series of weak emperors, and a general feeling of decay. The Byzantines were no longer a dominant force, and their relationship with the West, particularly the powerful and opportunistic Venetians, was growing increasingly hostile. This simmering animosity would boil over in a way that no one could have possibly predicted, leading to one of the most tragic and shocking events in Byzantine history, the Fourth Crusade and the brutal sack of Constantinople. It's a story of greed, political intrigue, and a massive historical detour that permanently altered the course of Europe. The Fourth Crusade began with good intentions, as most bad ideas do. Pope Innocent III called for a new crusade to recapture Jerusalem from the Muslims. The Crusaders, mostly French and German knights, decided to take a sea route and contracted with the city-state of Venice to build a fleet for them. The Venetians, led by their shrewd and almost certainly evil in a movie villain kind of way Doge, Enrico Dandolo, agreed to the deal, but the Crusaders, a disorganized bunch as usual, couldn't pay the full price for the fleet. Dandolo, who was blind but a brilliant politician, saw his opportunity. He offered a deal. He would forgive their debt if they helped him capture the city of Zara, a Christian city on the Adriatic that was a rival to Venice. The Crusaders, despite the Pope's furious protests, agreed and sacked Zara. This act earned them all an excommunication from the Pope, a bit of a sticky situation for a holy crusade. But the story gets even weirder. A young Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, who had been exiled by his uncle, the reigning emperor, saw the Crusader army as a way to reclaim his throne. He promised the Crusaders a massive amount of money, military support, and the reunion of the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches if they would help him. The Crusaders, ever a pragmatic group when it came to money, were easily convinced. They agreed to divert their crusade from the Holy Land and sail to Constantinople instead. The Venetian fleet, carrying the Crusaders, arrived outside the magnificent walls of Constantinople in 1203. The sight must have been terrifying. The Byzantines, who had never seen an army besiege their city from the sea, were shocked and horrified. The initial siege was successful. Alexios Angelos was crowned as Emperor Alexios IV, but he quickly found that he couldn't keep his promises. The city's treasury was empty, the population was hostile, and the clergy would not agree to a reunion with the Pope. The Crusaders, meanwhile, were getting impatient, and their financial demands grew. The situation devolved into chaos. The population of Constantinople rose up against Alexios IV and installed a new emperor, Mortzuflos. The Crusaders, feeling betrayed, decided they had had enough. In 1204, they launched a second full-scale assault on the city, this time not to install a puppet emperor, but to take it for themselves. The assault was brutal and shocking. The Crusaders broke through the walls, and the sack of Constantinople began. What followed was a horrific 3-day orgy of violence, looting, and destruction. Priceless works of art, magnificent libraries, and ancient relics were destroyed or carried off. Churches, including the Hagia Sophia, were desecrated. The city, the greatest city in the Christian world, was utterly ruined. The Crusaders, who had come to fight for Christ, had destroyed the heart of Eastern Christendom. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Fourth Crusade was a catastrophic event that fatally weakened the Byzantine Empire, from which it would never truly recover. The Crusaders established their own Latin Empire on the ruins, dividing the conquered territory among themselves. The Byzantine Empire was shattered into several smaller successor states, the most important of which was the Empire of Nicaea. The 1,000-year-old Roman Empire, in a way, died on that terrible day in 1204, not at the hands of its traditional enemies, but at the hands of its supposed Christian allies. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 was a cataclysmic event that tore the Byzantine Empire into pieces. The Crusaders, having done their dirty work, established the Latin Empire on the ruins, but they only controlled a part of the old Byzantine territory. The rest of the empire, like a shattered mirror, was now fragmented into several smaller successor states, all claiming to be the true heir to the Byzantine legacy. The most significant of these was the Empire of Nicaea, a small but fiercely determined state that would become the last hope for a Byzantine restoration. Its story is one of survival in exile, diplomatic maneuvering, and the long, slow, grinding work of rebuilding a broken civilization. The founder of the Empire of Nicaea was Theodore Thrush Lascaris, who was a son-in-law of the former emperor. After the fall of Constantinople, he fled across the Bosphorus to the city of Nicaea in Asia Minor. He was a natural leader, and he managed to rally the fleeing Byzantine nobles and clergy around him. In Nicaea, he established a new, legitimate center of power, a kind of government in exile. The city was strategically well defended and became a fortress for Byzantine culture and political life. The Nicaean emperors, Theodore and his successors, saw their primary goal as not just survival, but the reconquest of Constantinople. They were the true emperors, and the Latin Empire was an illegitimate, temporary occupation that had to be undone. The Nicaean emperors had to fight on multiple fronts. They were constantly at war with their neighbors, the Seljuk Turks to the east, and the other Byzantine successor states, particularly the Despotate of Epirus, who also wanted to be the one to liberate Constantinople. The Latin Empire, with its French knights and Venetian merchants, was a powerful military force, but it was also weak and unstable, a collection of feudal fiefdoms that never quite managed to gain the loyalty of the Greek population. This internal weakness was the Nicaean emperors' greatest advantage. They were the ones who had the support of the Orthodox Church and the deep loyalty of the local population, who saw them as their rightful rulers. The Nicaean emperors were shrewd diplomats and capable military commanders. They patiently expanded their territory in Asia Minor, using a combination of warfare and smart marriage alliances with the Turks to secure their borders. The empire became a hub of learning and culture, with scholars and artists flocking to Nicaea, preserving the traditions of Constantinople in exile. This was a crucial period for the preservation of Byzantine identity. It was here, in this small state, that the flame of the Byzantine Empire was kept alive, a faint but persistent flicker of light in the darkness. This brings us to John III, Ducas Vatatzes, one of the greatest of the Nicaean emperors. His long reign from 1222 to 1254 was a period of consolidation and expansion. He was a brilliant administrator and a cunning diplomat. He systematically expanded the Nicaean Empire, pushing back the Latins and the Despotate of Epirus, and establishing Nicaea as the dominant power in the region. He rebuilt the economy, which had been shattered by the sack of Constantinople, and he prepared the ground for the eventual return to the capital. He was so successful that by the time of his death, the Latin Empire was a ghost of its former self, a hollow shell waiting for the final blow. Historians still debate whether the Nicaean Empire could have survived as a separate entity without the goal of reconquest, but it's a mainstream historical fact that the goal of retaking Constantinople was the single most important factor that united the Nicaean people and gave them a sense of purpose. It was a dream, a quest for a lost home that fueled their resilience and their ambition. The Nicene Empire was a phoenix rising from the ashes of Constantinople, and it was getting ready to fly back home. The Byzantine Empire in exile, the Empire of Nicaea, had spent decades patiently biding its time, expanding its territory, and waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment came in 1261, and the man who seized it was Michael the Palaiologos. His story is one of a shrewd opportunist and a masterful diplomat who didn't just inherit a dream of restoration, he made it a reality. His reconquest of Constantinople wasn't a glorious, massive military campaign, but rather a perfect blend of luck, timing, and political savvy, a fitting end to a long period of exile. Michael VIII was a member of a powerful aristocratic family and a brilliant general. He had risen through the ranks of the Nicene court and in 1259 had managed to seize the throne from the young emperor, John IV Lascaris, a boy of just 8 years old. Michael's usurpation was a ruthless act. He had John blinded and imprisoned, a horrifying act that was all too common in Byzantine politics. With his power consolidated, he turned his full attention to the ultimate prize, Constantinople. He knew that the Latin Empire was a hollow shell, and he was determined to be the one to knock it over. The opportunity came in the summer of 1261. Michael VIII had sent a small reconnaissance force, led by his general Alexios Strategopoulos, to the outskirts of Constantinople. The general was simply supposed to scout the area and observe the Latin defenses, but he got lucky. He learned from some local farmers that the Latin garrison, including most of the Venetian fleet, had left the city to conduct a raid on one of the Nicaean islands. The city was left almost completely undefended. Alexios Strategopoulos saw his chance, and, in a moment of brilliant improvisation, he led his small force into the city through an unguarded gate. There was no massive battle, no long siege, no bloody assault. They simply walked in. When the Greek inhabitants of the city realized what was happening, they rose up in support of the Nicaean troops. The Latin garrison, what little was left of it, panicked and fled, and the Latin emperor, Baldwin II, barely escaped with his life. When the news reached Michael VIII, he was overjoyed. He had reclaimed the heart of the empire without a single major battle. He made a triumphant entry into Constantinople, and he was officially crowned as emperor in the Hagia Sophia. The Byzantine Empire was restored, but it was a much different empire than the one that had fallen in 1204. The city of Constantinople itself was a shadow of its former glory. It had been sacked and neglected for over 50 years, and its population had dwindled. The empire's territory was much smaller, and it was surrounded by powerful and hostile neighbors. The long-term goal of the empire for the next 2 centuries would be not expansion, but survival. Michael V's reign was a constant struggle to secure the empire against its enemies, particularly the vengeful Latins who wanted to reclaim their lost empire. He was a master of diplomacy, using a combination of treaties, marriage alliances, and a good old-fashioned double cross to keep his enemies at bay. He even went so far as to negotiate a union with the Catholic Church at the Second Council of Lyon in 1274, a deeply unpopular move that he knew would never be accepted by his own people, but which successfully placated the Pope and prevented a new crusade from being launched against him. This was a classic example of a Byzantine emperor putting political survival ahead of religious orthodoxy, a move that shows just how precarious their position was. The restoration of the Byzantine Empire under Michael VIII was a remarkable achievement, a testament to the resilience of the Byzantine people and the political genius of their new emperor. But it was also a restoration of a dying empire, one that was now a regional power at best. struggling to find its footing in a new and dangerous world. The glory days of Justinian and Basil II were long gone. The Palaiologan dynasty, which Michael founded, would be the final chapter in the Byzantine story, a long, slow decline that would end not with a triumphant reconquest, but with a final desperate siege. The Byzantine Empire was back in Constantinople, but the confetti and celebrations of 1261 quickly faded into the grim reality of a much reduced state. Michael VIII and his successors of the Palaiologan dynasty inherited an empire that was geographically small, politically fragile, and economically struggling. The dream of a universal Roman Empire was gone forever, replaced by the hard work of simply trying to survive. But even as the empire's political and military power waned, something remarkable happened. In a bit of historical irony, the final centuries of Byzantium saw a magnificent flowering of art, scholarship, and philosophy that historians call the Palaiologan Renaissance. It was as if the Byzantine mind, no longer burdened by the demands of a vast empire, turned inward and rediscovered its own brilliant heritage. This intellectual and cultural revival was centered in Constantinople and a few other major cities like Mistras in the Peloponnese. Scholars, many of whom had been exiled to the provinces during the Latin occupation, returned to the capital and began to engage in a frenzy of intellectual activity. They were no longer just compiling or commenting on old texts. They were actively studying and promoting classical Greek philosophy, literature, and science. The great thinkers of antiquity, like Plato and Aristotle, who had long been the subject of theological debates, were now being studied for their own sake. This wasn't just a simple rediscovery. It was a profound re-engagement with the classical past, a recognition that the Byzantine world was the direct heir to the brilliance of ancient Greece. The most famous of these scholars was a man named Gemistos Plethon, a brilliant philosopher who was a passionate admirer of Plato. He taught in Mystras, the center of Byzantine rule in Greece, and his lectures on Platonic philosophy were so influential that they attracted students from across the empire and even from Italy. Plethon was a bit of a character. He was so devoted to the classical world that he even proposed a return to a kind of neo-paganism, a rather wild idea that, as you can imagine, did not go over well with the Orthodox clergy. But his influence was immense, and he helped to spark a renewed interest in Plato that would have a major impact on the West. This intellectual revival was matched by a corresponding flowering of art. Artists created magnificent frescoes and mosaics that were more naturalistic and emotionally expressive than their earlier, more stylized counterparts. The icons and manuscripts of this period are some of the most beautiful in Byzantine history. The famous mosaics of the Chora Church in Constantinople, with their vibrant colors and dynamic compositions, are a perfect example of this artistic revival. The Hagia Sophia, which had been badly damaged and desecrated during the Latin occupation, was also restored and decorated with new mosaics. This artistic renaissance was a way for the Byzantines to reassert their cultural identity and their continuity with their glorious past, a powerful statement in the face of their political weakness. However, this cultural flourishing was happening against a backdrop of increasing political and military decline. The Palaiologan emperors were constantly fighting for their lives against enemies from all sides. They were a bit like a family with a beautiful, priceless antique vase that they have to move every 5 minutes to keep it from being knocked over. The empire's territory was shrinking. Its treasury was almost always empty, and its army was a shadow of its former self. But even in the midst of this decay, the Byzantine scholars and artists were doing something of incredible importance. They were preserving and promoting the classical knowledge and artistic traditions that would eventually be carried westward by a new generation of Greek scholars, fleeing the growing Ottoman threat. This intellectual migration would play a crucial, if often overlooked, role in the rise of the Italian Renaissance. It's a mainstream historical fact that this Paleologan Renaissance wasn't just a nostalgic echo of a glorious past. It was a vital bridge that would carry the light of classical antiquity from the east to the west, sparking a new era of European history. While the Byzantine scholars of the Paleologan Renaissance were busy rediscovering Plato, a new and far more dangerous force was gathering on their eastern borders, a force that had no interest in philosophy or art. This was the Ottoman Empire, a small but fiercely ambitious Turkish state that would grow to become the Byzantines' final and most formidable enemy. The story of the rise of the Ottomans is a grim and relentless one for the Byzantines, a slow and agonizing process of territorial loss and political strangulation that would ultimately lead to the end of their 1,000-year-old empire. The Ottomans began as one of many small Turkish principalities, or beyliks, that emerged in Asia Minor after the decline of the Seljuk Sultanate. Their founder, Osman I, was a brilliant military and political leader who established his power in the late 13th century on the Byzantine frontier. His principality, strategically located close to the weakened Byzantine state, was in the perfect position to expand. The Byzantine emperors of the time were too consumed with internal squabbles and external threats from the West and the Balkans to mount a serious, coordinated defense of their eastern border. This was a classic case of what happens when you're focused on fighting with your brother while a stranger is quietly building a fortress on your lawn. The Ottomans, fueled by a constant stream of warriors and adventurers seeking to fight for their faith, began to slowly chip away at Byzantine territory in Asia Minor. The most decisive moment in the Ottoman advance came with the capture of the city of Bursa in 1326. This was a major Byzantine city and a crucial economic hub, and its fall gave the Ottomans a powerful base of operations. From Bursa, they began to expand rapidly, conquering more and more of the Byzantine heartland in Asia Minor. The Byzantines, with a small and often demoralized army, could do little to stop them. Their appeals for help from the West were largely ignored, and their attempts to fight the Ottomans on their own were often disastrous. The Ottomans were a highly mobile, disciplined, and technologically advanced military force, and they quickly mastered the art of siege warfare. They were a bit like a steamroller, and the Byzantines were just a very old, very beautiful house, standing in its way. The Ottoman advance wasn't just a matter of military conquest. It was also a story of political savvy. The Ottomans were often pragmatic rulers who offered religious freedom to their Christian subjects, which helped to reduce resistance in the newly conquered territories. They also adopted Byzantine administrative practices and even used Byzantine-style coinage. This meant that for many people in Asia Minor, the change in rule, while not ideal, was not the total apocalypse they might have imagined. This pragmatic approach helped the Ottomans to consolidate their power and to slowly absorb the Byzantine population into their own growing empire. The Byzantine Empire was now a rump state, a collection of disconnected territories that were little more than a large city-state, surrounded by a sea of Ottoman power. The city of Constantinople itself was almost completely isolated, and the emperor was a monarch with little power beyond his own walls. The Ottomans crossed into Europe in the mid-14th century, establishing a foothold at Gallipoli and then expanding rapidly into the Balkans. They captured Adrianople, a major Byzantine city just west of Constantinople, and made it their new capital. This left Constantinople surrounded on all sides, a lonely island in an ever-growing Ottoman sea. The Byzantine emperor was now effectively an Ottoman vassal, paying tribute and often forced to send his sons to serve in the Ottoman army. It's a mainstream historical fact that the rise of the Ottoman Empire directly led to the fatal weakening and ultimate fall of the Byzantine state, but it wasn't a sudden, dramatic collapse. It was a slow, deliberate strangulation, a final, grim chapter in the long and complex story of the empire. The Ottoman Empire's expansion into the Balkans was a nightmare for the Byzantines, but it was also a major event for the region as a whole. The various Slavic kingdoms and principalities of the Balkans, Serbs, Bulgarians, and others, were a formidable military force in their own right, and they were not about to let the Ottomans take over without a fight. The Byzantine emperor, now a de facto vassal, could only watch as his neighbors were systematically dismantled. This brings us to a pivotal moment in this long, slow process of Ottoman consolidation, the Battle of Kosovo. This wasn't just a single battle, it was a defining moment in the history of the Balkans, a legendary event that would become a cornerstone of Serbian national identity and a chilling sign of things to come for the Byzantine Empire. The year is 1389, and the Ottomans, under Sultan Murad II, were on the march. They had already defeated the Bulgarians, and now they were facing a coalition of Balkan forces led by Prince Lazar of Serbia. The two armies met on a field known as Kosovo Polje, or the Field of Blackbirds. The battle was a massive, bloody affair, a clash of two very different military forces. The Serbs and their allies fought with a fierce determination, driven by a desire to defend their land and their faith. The Ottomans, with their disciplined Janissary infantry and their highly mobile cavalry, were a relentless and well-organized machine. The details of the battle are shrouded in legend, and historians still argue about the exact sequence of events, but the outcome is not in doubt. The Ottoman army was ultimately victorious. The Battle of Kosovo was a crushing defeat for the Balkan forces. Prince Lazar himself was captured and executed, and the majority of the Serbian nobility was killed on the battlefield. The defeat effectively broke the back of Serbian resistance and, within a few decades, led to the complete subjugation of Serbia by the Ottoman Empire. The battle became a powerful symbol for the Serbs, a story of heroic sacrifice in the face of impossible odds. It's a bit like the Alamo or Thermopylae, a tragic defeat that becomes a source of national pride and a rallying cry for future generations. For the Byzantines, however, it was a moment of pure dread. The fall of Serbia meant that the final buffer between Constantinople and the full force of the Ottoman Empire had been removed. The city was now truly and utterly alone. The Ottoman advance was relentless. After Kosovo, they continued to expand, conquering the rest of the Balkans and isolating Constantinople even further. The city, once the heart of a vast empire, was now little more than a fortress, a lonely outpost surrounded by hostile territory. The Byzantine emperors were in an impossible position. They were a bit like a king who owns a spectacular throne, but has no kingdom to go with it. They were forced to pay tribute to the Sultan, and they were often forced to participate in Ottoman military campaigns against their own neighbors. The once mighty Byzantine military was now a shadow of its former self, and the empire's ability to defend itself was almost non-existent. This grim reality meant that the Byzantines had to turn to new, desperate measures. The emperor, John the Fire Palaiologos, even traveled to Rome in 1369 in a desperate and ultimately futile attempt to secure military aid from the Pope by converting to Catholicism. It was a humiliating moment for the emperor and a sign of just how dire the situation had become. The Battle of Kosovo, while not a direct military engagement for the Byzantines, was a critical turning point that sealed their fate. It solidified Ottoman control over the Balkans, removing the last major obstacle to their expansion and leaving Constantinople in an incredibly precarious position. The clock was now ticking, and the long, slow decline of the empire was about to enter its final, tragic chapter. The last great act of the Byzantine Empire would not be a victory, but a final, desperate plea for help. With the Ottoman Empire now firmly established in the Balkans, the Byzantine emperors had to face a new and terrifying reality. The city of Constantinople, once the mighty heart of a vast empire, was now little more than an isolated island in a sea of Ottoman power. The long, slow decline had reached its final stage, and the emperors were forced to make a series of desperate and often humiliating pleas for help from the West. This brings us to the reign of John VIII the Palaiologos, a man who, like his predecessors, was on an impossible mission, but who would go to a truly remarkable length to try and save his city. He would travel to Italy to negotiate a reunion of the Eastern and Western churches. The year is 1438, and the situation for the Byzantines is dire. The Ottoman Sultan Murad II was a formidable foe, and his armies were a constant threat. The emperor's territory had shrunk to Constantinople and a few scattered outposts in the Peloponnese. John VIII knew that his empire could not survive without military aid from the West, and he also knew that the Western powers, particularly the Pope, were not going to give him that aid out of the goodness of their hearts. They had a price, and that price was the end of the Great Schism of 1054 and the submission of the Orthodox Church to the authority of the Pope. It was a deal that was deeply unpopular with the Byzantine people and clergy, who had a long history of animosity and theological disagreement with the West. The Filioque controversy, the debate over whether the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, was just one of the many issues that separated the two churches. Despite this popular opposition, John VIII made the decision to go. He assembled a large delegation of scholars, theologians, and bishops, and set off for Italy. The journey was a massive undertaking, and the delegation included some of the most brilliant minds of the Palaiologan Renaissance. They were received with great fanfare in Italy, a bit like a group of celebrity academics arriving for a major conference, and they were taken to the Council of Ferrara, which was later moved to Florence. The council was a marathon of theological debate, with both sides arguing their points with immense passion and scholarship. The Byzantines were at a distinct disadvantage. They were the supplicants, the ones asking for help, and they were also a much smaller and less powerful delegation. The pressure on them was immense, and the Pope made it clear that there would be no military aid without a union. After months of intense debate and political pressure, the Byzantine delegation, under duress, agreed to the terms of a union. On July 6, 1439, a decree of union was signed, formally bringing the Eastern and Western churches back together. The decree was, for all intents and purposes, a capitulation by the Byzantines. It accepted the supremacy of the Pope, the Latin doctrine of purgatory, and the Filioque clause. John VIII and his delegation returned to Constantinople with the decree in hand, hoping that it would be enough to secure a crusade to save their city. But when they arrived, they found a city that was furious. The Byzantine population and the majority of the clergy refused to accept the union. They saw it as a betrayal of their faith and their identity, a deal made with the devil. A famous saying of the time was, "Better the turban of the Turk than the tiara of the Pope." The union, for all its grand proclamations, was dead on arrival. The Council of Florence was a diplomatic failure. The military aid from the West never materialized in any meaningful way, and the union that was supposed to save the empire only served to alienate the Byzantine people and create more internal division. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Byzantine delegation's agreement to the union in Florence was a desperate political act that failed to achieve its primary goal and only deepened the sense of hopelessness in the dying empire. John VIII, the last Byzantine emperor to rule with some semblance of power, would die a few years later, leaving his brother to inherit a city that was now standing completely alone, waiting for the inevitable final siege. The Council of Florence was a bust. John the Wythe, Palaiologos, had returned from Italy with a piece of paper that was worth less than the ink it was printed on, and the military aid he had so desperately sought never materialized. The Byzantine Empire was now at a dead end, a city-state with a magnificent past and a very uncertain future. The man who would have to face this grim reality was his brother, Constantine the Palaiologos, the last Byzantine emperor. His reign, which began in 1449, was not one of grand victories or glorious achievements, but one of preparing for the inevitable. It was a long, slow walk to the gallows, and Constantine Zeron, to his credit, walked it with immense dignity and courage. Constantine V was a highly capable and experienced leader, having served as a governor in the Peloponnese, where he had a reputation as a successful military commander. But the situation he inherited was impossible. The city of Constantinople was a shadow of its former self, with a population that had shrunk to around 50,000 people. Its magnificent walls were still a formidable defense, but they were in disrepair, and the treasury was completely empty, a problem that made it difficult to pay for repairs or to hire mercenaries. The empire's territory had shrunk to Constantinople itself and the despotate of the Morea in the Peloponnese, a small, disconnected outpost that was of little help in the defense of the capital. The empire was, in a word, a ghost. The final hammer blow came in 1451 with the ascension of a new Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II. Mehmed was a young, brilliant, and ferociously ambitious man who had a singular goal: to conquer Constantinople. He saw the city not as a relic, but as the key to a vast new empire, a city that would become the heart of the Ottoman world. He was a man with a plan, and he moved with a speed and ruthlessness that shocked everyone. His first move was to build a massive fortress, the Rumeli Hizara, on the European side of the Bosphorus, just a few miles from Constantinople. This fortress, built in a matter of months, gave the Ottomans complete control of the strait, effectively cutting off the city from any help from the Black Sea. It was a clear declaration of intent. The Sultan wasn't just raiding, he was planning a siege, a final, total confrontation. Constantine V knew what was coming. He sent desperate pleas for help to the Pope and the Western powers, but they were either too preoccupied with their own wars or too jaded by the Byzantines' earlier failed promises to send any significant aid. The city was left to its own devices, a lonely island surrounded by an ever-growing Ottoman sea. Constantine Serene, however, was not a man to surrender without a fight. He worked tirelessly to prepare the city for the coming siege. He repaired the walls, stockpiled food, and tried to raise money to hire mercenaries. He also had to deal with the constant internal strife of his own city. The issue of the union with the Catholic Church was still a major point of contention, and the population was deeply divided, with many still preferring to fall to the Turks than to submit to the Pope. Constantine V, despite the impossible odds, remained a symbol of hope and defiance. He was the last of the Roman emperors, a man who had nothing left to defend but a memory and a city. His preparations were meticulous, but they were no match for the sheer size and power of the Ottoman war machine. Mehmed II was building a massive army, and he was also building a secret weapon, a gigantic cannon that would be capable of breaking down the seemingly impregnable walls of Constantinople. The stage was set for a final, tragic showdown, a battle that would not just be for a city, but for the end of an era. The last Roman emperor was about to face the man who would become the master of the East, and the world was about to change forever. The stage was set for the final act of a 1,000-year-old drama. The city of Constantinople was a solitary candle in the wind, and the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II was the storm. In April of 1453, Mehmed and his army, a force of perhaps 80,000 to 100,000 professional soldiers, not including a huge number of irregulars and camp followers, laid siege to the city. The Byzantine defenders, a motley crew of around 7,000 men, were commanded by the last emperor, Constantine V's Palaiologos, and a small number of foreign volunteers, most notably the brilliant Genoese commander Giovanni Justiniani. The odds were, to put it mildly, not in their favor. The siege began with the thunderous roar of cannons, Mehmed's secret weapon. The massive cannon, the urban bombard, was a truly terrifying piece of technology, capable of launching stone balls weighing over 1,000 pounds. The Byzantine walls, which had stood for over 1,000 years and had repelled countless sieges, were now facing a weapon they were not designed to withstand. The bombardment was relentless, a constant nerve-shattering rain of stone that slowly but surely began to breach the outer defenses. The defenders, however, fought with incredible courage and ingenuity, repairing the breaches at night and holding their ground against repeated assaults. The naval aspect of the siege was also crucial. Mehmed's navy, a powerful fleet of over 100 ships, was attempting to break through the Golden Horn, the natural harbor that protected the city's northern flank. The Byzantines had sealed the harbor with a massive chain, but Mehmed, a man of extraordinary vision, simply had his engineers build a wooden slipway and, in a single night, dragged his ships overland and into the Golden Horn, bypassing the chain completely. It was a logistical marvel that completely outflanked the defenders and demoralized the population. It was a clear sign that this was a new kind of war, fought by a new kind of leader. Despite the impossible odds, the defenders of Constantinople held on for weeks. The fighting was brutal and hand-to-hand, a grim and bloody affair. There was a brief moment of hope when a small Venetian fleet, loaded with supplies, managed to break through the Ottoman blockade. A small but powerful victory that showed the world that the city could still be helped. But these moments of hope were fleeting. The Ottoman bombardment continued, and the walls were now on the verge of collapse. The final assault came on May 29, 1453. It was a massive, all-out attack on every single part of the land wall. The Janissaries, Mehmed's elite infantry, led the charge, and they were relentless. The Byzantine defenders, exhausted and outnumbered, fought to the last man. The final moments are shrouded in legend, but the story goes that Constantine V, seeing that the city was lost, stripped off his imperial regalia, and with a final cry of, "The city is fallen, but I am still alive," charged into the fray, fighting and dying as a simple soldier. His body was never found. The Ottomans poured into the city, and a period of bloody chaos ensued before Mehmed II rode into the city and went straight to the Hagia Sophia, where he ordered it to be converted into a mosque. The fall of Constantinople was not just the fall of a city, it was the end of a 1,000-year-old empire, the last vestige of the Roman world. It was a mainstream historical fact that this event marked the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the early modern period. The empire was gone, but its legacy was not. The world was about to change forever. The fall of Constantinople was a devastating end for the Byzantine Empire, but it was not the end of its story. The conqueror, Sultan Mehmed II, was a man who, despite his ruthless ambition, had a deep and abiding respect for the culture and learning of the people he had just defeated. The Ottoman Empire, in its own way, became the inheritor of the Byzantine legacy, absorbing its traditions, its people, and even its administrative structures. The city of Constantinople, now renamed Istanbul, would become the capital of the Ottoman Empire for the next 5 centuries, and its transformation is a testament to the enduring influence of Byzantium. Mehmed II, the man who had laid the city to waste, immediately set about rebuilding it. He saw Istanbul as the new center of his burgeoning empire, and he wanted it to be as grand, if not grander, than it had been under the Byzantines. He converted the Hagia Sophia into a mosque, a symbolic act that showed the new religious order, but he also left the building's magnificent structure intact, a testament to its architectural brilliance. Other churches were also converted, but he also allowed the Christian population to rebuild and practice their faith, albeit under Ottoman rule. He appointed a new Orthodox patriarch, a man named Gennadios, and gave him authority over the Christian population, creating a system that allowed the Byzantines to maintain their cultural and religious identity within the new Ottoman state. This was a pragmatic and clever move that helped to integrate the conquered people into the new empire without constant rebellion. The cultural and architectural legacy of Byzantium was everywhere in the new Ottoman capital. The great walls of Constantinople, which had just been breached, were repaired and maintained. The Hippodrome, once the center of Byzantine social and political life, remained a central public space, even if its function had changed. Ottoman architects and artists were deeply influenced by Byzantine models. The great Ottoman architect Mimar Sinan, for example, would later build mosques that were clearly inspired by the Hagia Sophia, with its massive central dome and soaring arches. The mosaic tiles, the intricate patterns, and the architectural principles of Byzantium were all absorbed into the new Ottoman style, a bit like a student who learns from the master and then adds their own flourishes. The Ottoman Empire also inherited a large number of Byzantine officials, scholars, and soldiers, who were now integrated into the new administration. The Byzantine bureaucracy, with its sophisticated system of taxation and administration, was a useful model for the Ottomans, who were still a relatively new state. The Byzantine ruling class, the Phanariots, a Greek community living in the Fanar district of Istanbul, would continue to play a crucial role in Ottoman administration for centuries, serving as diplomats, interpreters, and administrators. This shows that the fall of the empire was not a total cultural erasure. The people, their traditions, and their knowledge were all still there, just under new management. Historians still argue whether the Ottoman Empire was a true successor to the Byzantine Empire, or just a conqueror that happened to set up shop in the old capital. But what is a mainstream historical fact is that the Ottoman Empire, particularly in its early centuries, was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire that borrowed heavily from the institutions and culture of its predecessors, particularly Byzantium. The long, slow decline of the empire had ended, but its story had not. It had simply transitioned into a new, and in many ways, just as magnificent, chapter of world history, a testament to the old saying that the only thing that truly dies is the idea of a thing, not the thing itself. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans was not just a local event. It was a seismic shockwave that rippled across Europe, forcing many to consider the fate of a civilization that had been a dominant force for over 1,000 years. But the Byzantine story did not end with the fall of the city. In a fascinating twist of history, the cultural and religious legacy of Byzantium found a new and lasting home to the north, in the vast lands of what we now call Russia. The Byzantines had been cultivating this relationship for centuries, and it would be in Russia that their traditions would be preserved and flourish, a testament to the old empire's enduring influence. The story of the Byzantine influence on Russia begins in the late 10th century with the Kievan Rus, a powerful federation of East Slavic tribes. Prince Vladimir the Great of Kiev was a pragmatic ruler, and he was looking for a new, unifying religion for his people. He famously sent envoys to various religious centers to learn about their faiths. The envoys who visited Constantinople were completely overwhelmed by the beauty and grandeur of the Byzantine liturgy. They reportedly told Vladimir, "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth, for on earth there is no such splendor or such beauty, and we are at a loss how to describe it." This powerful aesthetic and spiritual experience was a major factor in Vladimir's decision to convert to Orthodox Christianity in 988 AD. This was a monumental decision that would forever link the destiny of Russia with the Byzantine world. The conversion of the Kievan Rus led to a massive influx of Byzantine culture, art, and religion into Russia. Byzantine priests, artists, and architects were sent to Kiev to help establish the new church. The first great churches in Kiev, like the Cathedral of St. Sophia, were built in the Byzantine style, with magnificent domes, frescoes, and mosaics. The Cyrillic alphabet, which had been developed by two Byzantine missionaries, Cyril and Methodius, to translate religious texts for the Slavs, was adopted by the Russians and became the basis for their written language. The Byzantine legal codes and administrative practices were also adopted, helping to shape the early Russian state. The Russians also inherited a key Byzantine political idea, the concept of the emperor as the divinely appointed head of both the state and the church. This concept of a powerful autocratic ruler would become a cornerstone of Russian political thought for centuries, a legacy that can still be seen in the centralized nature of the Russian state today. When Constantinople fell in 1453, the Russians saw themselves as the rightful heirs to the Byzantine legacy. The Grand Prince of Moscow, Ivan III, married Sophia Palaiologina, the niece of the last Byzantine emperor, and he began to style himself as the successor to the Roman emperors. He adopted the double-headed eagle of Byzantium as the new Russian coat of arms, and Moscow began to be referred to as the Third Rome, the city that would carry on the Orthodox faith and the imperial tradition of Constantinople after the fall of the First Rome and the Second. This was more than just a symbolic gesture. The Russian Orthodox Church, now independent of the Patriarch of Constantinople, saw itself as the new defender of the Orthodox faith. Russian monasteries and scholars preserved Byzantine religious texts and traditions, which were now under threat in the Ottoman-ruled Balkans and Greece. The artistic and religious traditions of Byzantium continued to flourish in Russia, a testament to the idea that a cultural legacy can be more powerful and more enduring than a political empire. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Byzantine Empire's spiritual and cultural influence on Russia was profound and lasting, shaping everything from their religion and art to their political ideology and national identity. While the Byzantine cultural and religious legacy was being carried north to Russia, something equally important was happening in the opposite direction. As the Ottoman threat to Constantinople grew, a new generation of Byzantine scholars and artists began to pack their bags and head west to the Italian peninsula. They were not just refugees, they were carriers of a precious cargo, the lost knowledge of ancient Greece. This migration of scholars, which peaked in the final decades of the empire, played a crucial and often overlooked role in sparking one of the most important periods in Western history, the Italian Renaissance. The Italians had long been separated from the great classical heritage that was preserved in Byzantium. While Western Europe had been largely cut off from the original Greek texts, Byzantine scholars had been reading, copying, and commenting on them for over 1,000 years. When these Byzantine scholars began to arrive in Italy in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, they brought with them a treasure trove of Greek manuscripts that the West had not seen in centuries. They brought with them the works of Plato, Aristotle, and other ancient philosophers, as well as works of Greek literature, history, and science. This influx of new information was like a shot of adrenaline to the Italian intellectual community, which was already beginning to show a renewed interest in classical learning. One of the most famous of these migrating scholars was the philosopher Gemistos Plethon, who we briefly mentioned earlier. He was a brilliant and eccentric man who was a passionate admirer of Plato. He traveled to Italy as part of the Byzantine delegation to the Council of Florence in 1438, the same council where John the Wythe Palaiologos tried to unite the churches. While the political negotiations were a failure, Plethon's lectures on Plato in Florence were a stunning success. He inspired a new generation of Italian humanists, including Cosimo de' Medici, who went on to found the Platonic Academy in Florence, a key institution of the Renaissance. It's a mainstream historical fact that the arrival of Plethon and his colleagues directly led to a major shift in Italian intellectual life, a shift from the dominant Aristotelian philosophy of the Middle Ages to a new Platonic-inspired humanism. But the influence was not just philosophical. The Byzantine scholars also brought with them a new way of approaching the study of texts. They were trained in the sophisticated Greek philological tradition, which gave them a deeper understanding of the original language and context of the ancient works. This led to a new, more critical approach to scholarship in Italy, a bit like giving a group of people a black and white photocopy of a masterpiece, and then having someone show up with the original full-color painting. The difference was staggering, and it led to a whole new way of thinking about the classical past. The migration of scholars also had a profound impact on the arts. Byzantine artists and craftsmen who fled to Italy brought with them their knowledge of mosaic work, icon painting, and architectural techniques. While the Italian Renaissance was a unique and distinctly Western phenomenon, it was undeniably influenced by the skills and traditions that were carried westward from Byzantium. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 only accelerated this process as more and more scholars and artists fled the Ottoman advance. They were, in a way, the final gift of a dying empire, and their arrival in Italy was a key factor in the explosion of creativity and learning that we now call the Renaissance. The legacy of Byzantium was not just a historical memory. It was a living, breathing force that was helping to shape the birth of a new era. While the Palaiologan Renaissance was a testament to the enduring intellectual vitality of Byzantium, it's easy to get lost in the stories of emperors and battles. But the empire's story also has another, often overlooked dimension: the powerful and influential women who navigated the treacherous world of the Byzantine court. From empresses to regents, these women were not just passive figures on the sidelines. They were players in the great game of power, and their stories are a fascinating look at the unique opportunities and challenges that Byzantine society presented for women in positions of authority. The role of Byzantine empresses was, from the very beginning, a powerful and public one. They were not just the consorts of the emperor, they were his partners in power. They were crowned in their own right, and their names often appeared alongside their husbands on coins and official documents. They had their own courts, their own treasuries, and their own political agendas. One of the earliest and most influential of these women was Pulcheria, the older sister of Emperor Theodosius II. When Theodosius was a child, she ruled as his regent, and she was a brilliant and effective administrator. She was the one who oversaw the construction of the Theodosian walls, the magnificent fortifications that would defend Constantinople for over 1,000 years. She was a deeply pious woman, and she played a key role in the theological debates of the 5th century, using her influence to support the orthodox position against various heresies. Her power was so great that she was eventually crowned empress in her own right, and she was a force to be reckoned with. Another powerful empress was Theodora, the wife of Justinian. While the story of her rise from an actress to an empress is a bit salacious, her influence on her husband was immense and undeniable. She was his confidant, his political advisor, and his co-ruler. It was Theodora who famously rallied Justinian during the Nika riots when he was on the verge of fleeing the city. She reportedly told him that a royal purple robe made for a beautiful shroud, and her famous speech inspired him to stay and fight, a decision that saved his reign. She was also a powerful patron of the arts and a defender of women's rights, using her influence to pass laws that protected prostitutes and women in general. Her story is a testament to the idea that a woman in Byzantium, even one with a controversial past, could wield real and lasting power. But the most famous example of a woman in power, and perhaps the most ruthless, was Empress Irene, the woman we met during the iconoclast controversy. She was not just a powerful regent, she was an empress in her own right, a woman who usurped the throne from her own son and ruled the empire alone. Her story, a mix of religious piety and cold-blooded ambition, shows the lengths to which a woman could go to hold on to power in Byzantium. She was a master of political maneuvering, and she successfully restored the veneration of icons, a major and lasting achievement. Her reign, while short and brutal, was a moment when a woman stood at the pinnacle of power and ruled an empire with a will of iron. Historians still debate whether the prominence of these women was a sign of a more egalitarian society or just a testament to their own extraordinary personalities. But what is a mainstream historical fact is that Byzantine women, particularly in the imperial family, held a degree of power and public prominence that was virtually unheard of in medieval Europe. Their stories are not just footnotes, they are a central part of the Byzantine narrative, a look into a world where a woman could build a city, save an emperor, or rule an empire with a ruthless efficiency that would make a modern politician blush. While the Byzantine empresses were busy making their mark on history, the artistic and architectural legacy of the empire was also blossoming, creating a visual language that was as enduring as its political institutions. The Byzantines were master builders and artists, and their work was not just about aesthetics. It was about theology, power, and a deep sense of a divine connection. From the soaring domes of their churches to the intricate mosaics that covered their walls, Byzantine art and architecture were a complete and total expression of their world. It was a fusion of Roman engineering, Greek aesthetics, and Christian spirituality, and it was a style that would influence art for centuries to come. The most famous example of this is, of course, the Hagia Sophia. Built under the orders of Justinian in the 6th century, it was a masterpiece of engineering that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The massive central dome, with its ring of windows at the base, appeared to float in the air, creating a breathtaking sense of divine light pouring down from heaven. When it was first completed, the historian Procopius wrote that it seemed to hang by a golden chain from heaven, a perfect description of its otherworldly beauty. The interior was a dazzling display of marble columns, intricate carvings, and most importantly, mosaics. The Hagia Sophia was a monument to the power of the emperor and the glory of God, and its architectural brilliance would be emulated, though never truly replicated, by architects for 1,000 years. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Hagia Sophia was the largest cathedral in the world for nearly 1,000 years. But the Byzantines were not just about grand, massive structures. They were also masters of the smaller, more intimate forms of art. Their mosaics, in particular, were stunning. They used tiny pieces of glass and stone, or tesserae, to create vibrant, shimmering images that seemed to capture the light and move with the viewer. These mosaics were not just decoration. They were a way of telling the biblical story, of teaching the illiterate about the saints and the life of Christ. The famous mosaics of the Cora Church, for example, are a masterpiece of storytelling, with their vibrant colors and emotional depictions of biblical scenes. The artists of this period were able to convey a sense of human emotion and drama that was a new innovation in art, a departure from the more static, formal style of earlier periods. Another key feature of Byzantine art was the icon. Icons were not just paintings. They were considered to be sacred objects, a window to the divine. They were painted on wooden panels, and they were venerated by the faithful, who believed that they were a conduit for prayers and miracles. The iconoclastic controversy, which we talked about earlier, was a testament to how seriously the Byzantines took this art form. The debate was not just about a painting. It was about the very nature of worship and the role of images in the Christian faith. The final resolution of the controversy, which restored the veneration of icons, was a moment of triumph for the Byzantine artistic tradition, and it led to a new golden age of icon painting. The Byzantine artistic and architectural legacy was immense. It spread throughout the Orthodox world, influencing everything from the churches of Russia to the monasteries of Greece. It was a style that was meant to inspire awe and reverence, to create a sense of being in the presence of the divine. And even after the fall of the empire, the traditions were carried on by artists and craftsmen, and their works continue to stand today as a powerful testament to the ingenuity and spiritual devotion of the Byzantine people. Their art wasn't just pretty to look at. It was a prayer made visible. While the Byzantine emperors and empresses were busy with politics and piety, the empire's military was quietly perfecting the art of survival. This wasn't the Roman legion of old, marching in rigid formation to conquer the world. This was a new kind of army, one that was flexible, professional, and technologically advanced, a force that was built to defend a vast and often threatened empire. The Byzantine military system and its strategic doctrines were a marvel of medieval warfare, and they were a key reason why the empire was able to survive for as long as it did, a bit like a wily old boxer who knows how to take a hit and keep fighting. The most important reform came with the creation of the theme system, which began under Emperor Heraclius in the 7th century. This was a radical departure from the old Roman model of a centralized army. The empire was divided into military districts, or themes, and each theme was governed by a general who had both military and civilian authority. Soldiers were granted land in exchange for military service, which meant that they were both landowners and professional soldiers, a system that provided the empire with a large, well-trained, and highly motivated fighting force. This system was incredibly effective because it decentralized power and created a powerful, self-sufficient defense force that was deeply invested in the survival of their own land. It also meant that the empire had a large number of soldiers who could be called upon at a moment's notice, without the financial burden of a massive standing army. The Byzantine army was also a master of military strategy and tactics. They were not afraid to use deception, feigned retreats, and psychological warfare to outsmart their enemies. They were incredibly good at siege warfare, both in defending their own cities and in attacking their enemies. Their fortifications were second to none, with Constantinople's Theodosian walls being the most famous example. The Byzantines also pioneered the use of a secret weapon, a terrifying incendiary substance known as Greek fire. The exact composition of Greek fire is still a mystery to historians, but it was a bit like a medieval napalm, a liquid fire that could not be extinguished with water and was devastatingly effective in naval battles. The use of Greek fire gave the Byzantines a crucial advantage in their struggles against the Islamic navies, and was a major reason why Constantinople was able to survive multiple sieges. The Byzantine military was also incredibly well organized and disciplined. They had a sophisticated system of military manuals, or tactica, that laid out everything from how to organize a march to how to deal with different types of enemies. These manuals show a deep and profound understanding of military history and strategy, and they were a testament to the empire's intellectual and military prowess. The Byzantine army also had a diverse and specialized military, with professional units like the famous Varangian Guard, a group of elite mercenaries who were primarily made up of Vikings and Anglo-Saxons. They were the emperor's personal bodyguard, and their ferocity in battle was legendary. Historians still argue whether the Byzantine military was a true successor to the Roman legions, but it's a mainstream historical fact that the Byzantine military was one of the most effective and professional fighting forces of the Middle Ages. It was a military that was built not for grand conquest, but for survival, and its ingenuity, discipline, and technological superiority were a major reason why a small, geographically vulnerable empire was able to stand for 1,000 years against a sea of enemies. It was an empire that knew how to defend itself, and its military was the sharp, unyielding edge that kept it from being swallowed whole. While the Byzantine military was busy building walls and perfecting Greek fire, the empire's leaders were also masters of another, more subtle art: diplomacy. The Byzantines were not always strong enough to win on the battlefield, so they had to be brilliant enough to win in the negotiation room. They perfected a form of what we would now call soft power, using a combination of ceremony, trade, marriage alliances, and religious influence to manage their neighbors. They were a bit like a modern superpower that uses its cultural and economic might to influence other countries, and this sophisticated system of diplomacy was a key reason why they were able to survive for so long. The Byzantines understood the power of spectacle. When a foreign ruler or ambassador arrived in Constantinople, they were treated to a magnificent display of imperial grandeur. The throne room of the Great Palace was designed to impress, with mechanical lions that roared and a throne that would magically rise into the air. The whole thing was a bit like a medieval theme park ride, but it was incredibly effective. It was meant to overawe the visitors and to reinforce the idea that the Byzantine emperor was not just a king, but a divinely appointed ruler who stood head and shoulders above all others. This ceremony, or theater of power, as some historians call it, was a crucial part of Byzantine diplomacy. It made their allies feel important and their enemies feel small, but it wasn't all smoke and mirrors. The Byzantines also used a much more practical form of diplomacy: trade. Constantinople was the commercial hub of the Mediterranean world, and the Byzantines knew how to use their economic power to their advantage. They granted trade privileges to their allies, and they used embargoes to punish their enemies. The powerful Italian city-states of Venice and Genoa, who we talked about earlier, were a testament to the power of this kind of economic diplomacy. The Byzantines gave them special trading rights, which made them incredibly wealthy, and for a time made them powerful allies. Of course, this also backfired later, but for a long time, it was a very effective way of keeping the Italians on their side. The Byzantines were also masters of marriage alliances. They would marry their princesses to foreign rulers, a practice that created a network of family ties and political obligations that stretched across Europe. This was a particularly effective way of managing the various Slavic and Germanic tribes on their borders. A Frankish or Russian ruler who was married to a Byzantine princess was much less likely to invade the empire than one who was not. This was a long-term strategy that was meant to create a sense of shared interest and to prevent war, a bit like a modern-day diplomatic treaty, but with much fancier dresses and much more complicated family dinners. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the Byzantines used their religious influence as a form of diplomacy. The Orthodox Church was a powerful cultural force, and the Byzantines were keen to spread their version of Christianity to their neighbors. The conversion of the Kievan Rus was a perfect example of this. The Byzantines didn't just give them a new religion, they gave them a new culture, a new alphabet, and a new way of organizing their state. This created a new family of Orthodox nations that looked to Constantinople for spiritual and political guidance. This religious diplomacy was an incredibly effective way of building a Byzantine commonwealth of nations that was bound together not just by treaties, but by a shared faith and culture. Historians still argue about the exact composition of Greek fire, but it's a mainstream historical fact that Byzantine diplomacy was a key reason why the empire was able to survive for so long, and it was a model that would be emulated by states for centuries to come. The Byzantine Empire was a state that was, in many ways, defined by its relationship with the Christian Church. This wasn't a modern separation of church and state. It was a deep, intimate, and often contentious relationship that was a constant source of both strength and strife. The Byzantine emperor was not just a political ruler, he was also seen as the head of the Christian people, a divinely appointed figure who had a sacred duty to defend the Orthodox faith. This concept, known as Caesaropapism, meant that the emperor had a powerful role in church affairs, and it created a unique dynamic that was at the very heart of the Byzantine world. The central figure in this relationship, other than the emperor, was the Patriarch of Constantinople. He was the head of the Orthodox Church, and his authority was second only to the emperor. The Patriarch was not just a religious leader, he was a major political player. He had a massive influence on the people, and he often acted as a check on the emperor's power, a bit like a medieval Supreme Court justice who had a direct line to God. The relationship between the emperor and the patriarch was often a tense and complicated dance. Some emperors would try to dominate the patriarch, appointing their own men and controlling church policy, while others would have to bow to the patriarch's immense spiritual authority. The story of Emperor Theodosius doing penance for a massacre he ordered is a perfect example of this. The patriarch, a man named Ambrose, was able to humble the most powerful man in the world, a testament to the moral authority of the church. The church was also a powerful social and cultural force. The monasteries, in particular, were not just centers of prayer and contemplation. They were also major landowners, centers of learning, and powerful political institutions. The monks were often the fiercest defenders of the Orthodox faith, and they were the ones who stood up to the iconoclast emperors and refused to submit to the union with the Catholic Church. They were a bit like a medieval version of a political party, a powerful and organized group that could influence public opinion and challenge imperial policy. The Byzantine Church also played a crucial role in the empire's foreign policy. The spread of Orthodox Christianity to the Balkans and to Russia was a form of soft power that created a new family of nations that were bound to the Byzantines by a shared faith and culture. The Church was also a key part of the Byzantine identity. In a world of constant invasion and political upheaval, the Orthodox faith was the one thing that held the Byzantine people together. It was their culture, their history, and their hope for salvation, and it was a powerful force that transcended political boundaries. Historians still argue whether the Byzantine Church was a tool of the state or an independent power, but it's a mainstream historical fact that the church and the state were inextricably linked, and their relationship was one of the most defining features of the Byzantine world. The Great Schism of 1054, the formal split between the Eastern and Western churches, was a culmination of centuries of theological and political differences. It was a major blow to the idea of a unified Christendom, and it left the Byzantine Church isolated from the rest of Europe. But it also made the Byzantine people more fiercely protective of their own faith and their own traditions, and it created a sense of a unique Orthodox identity that would endure long after the empire itself had fallen. The Church was not just a part of the Byzantine story. It was, in many ways, the hero of the story, the one thing that outlasted the emperors, the armies, and the walls themselves. We've now reached the end of this long, winding road. We've watched the Byzantine Empire rise from the ashes of the old Roman world, blossom into a magnificent golden age under Justinian, and then, after a long, slow decline, fall to the Ottomans. But the story of Byzantium, as we've seen, doesn't end with the fall of a city. Its legacy is a sprawling, complex tapestry that is woven into the very fabric of the modern world, a legacy that is much more than just a historical footnote. Its most obvious legacy is, of course, its direct cultural and political inheritance. The Ottoman Empire, which we now know was not just a conqueror, but a successor, built its capital on the ruins of Constantinople and absorbed much of its administrative and cultural traditions. The Russian Empire, in its own way, became the new defender of the Orthodox faith, adopting the Byzantine court rituals, the double-headed eagle, and the idea of a divinely appointed emperor. The Byzantine legal codes, which were perfected under Justinian, would go on to influence the civil law systems of modern Europe, and its artistic and architectural traditions would continue to inspire artists and architects for centuries to come. The very idea of an emperor, of a ruler who stands above all others, is in some ways a legacy of the Byzantine state, but the legacy is also a much more subtle and profound one. The Byzantines were the great preservers of classical knowledge. While the rest of Europe was struggling through the Dark Ages, they were reading, copying, and commenting on the works of Plato, Aristotle, and the great thinkers of antiquity. They were the bridge that connected the ancient world to the modern one, and their role in the Italian Renaissance was a crucial and often overlooked part of the story. The Greek scholars who fled the dying empire carried with them a treasure trove of manuscripts that helped to spark a new age of learning and creativity in the West. This was perhaps their final and greatest gift to the world, a gift of knowledge that would change the course of human history. The Byzantine Empire was a state that was defined by its resilience, its deep faith, and its ability to adapt in the face of impossible odds. It was a state that was, in a very real way, the guardian of civilization, a fortress that stood for 1,000 years against a sea of enemies, and its story is a testament to the power of a culture to endure. So, when you think of the Roman Empire, remember that it didn't just end in the West. It lived on for another 1,000 years, in a city on the Bosphorus, and its final act was not a death, but a transition, a slow fading of the light that would, in the end, help to ignite a new one. And with that, our long journey through the history of the Byzantine Empire comes to an end. It's a story of ambition and betrayal, of art and war, of faith and power, a story that is as rich and complex as the mosaics that still gleam in its ancient churches. It's a story that reminds us that history is not just a series of dates and names, but a living, breathing force that continues to shape our world. So, let the final echoes of this long and glorious history fade into the darkness. Let the images of 1,000 years, of emperors, saints, and soldiers, soften and blur into a quiet, sleepy calm. We're closing the book on this chapter now, a long, epic chapter that has finally gently come to its peaceful conclusion. The great walls of Constantinople, the shimmering mosaics of the Hagia Sophia, the final stand of the last emperor, these are now just whispers in the quiet of the night, beautiful, distant echoes that have finally, beautifully gone to rest.